You're standing barefoot on the shore of a lake in Utah, and it's 12,000 years before your birth. There's no word for tobacco yet. There's no word for anything you'd recognize. But there's a fire, and there's smoke, and there's a person crouched beside it who just did something that would echo across every human culture that would ever exist. Before we get to that person, though, you need to understand something most people never think about. Fire didn't just give humans warmth and cooked meat. It gave them something stranger, something almost chemical. Picture a species that spent nearly 1 million years sitting in front of open flames every single night. Not for an evening, not for a season, for generation after generation after generation, stretching back to a smaller-brained cousin of yours called Homo erectus, who huddled in a cave in South Africa and tended fires that archaeologists would later find as burnt ash and scorched bone. That's the oldest confirmed proof of controlled fire use anywhere on Earth. 1 million years old. Before language. Before anything you'd call civilization. Just heat, light, and smoke curling into faces night after night after night. Here's the part that should stop you for a second. Fire alone does something to the human body, not because of what's burning in it, but simply because it exists. Researchers studying human physiology found that when people sit and watch a fire crackle, their blood pressure drops. Measurably. No smoke required, no plant required. Just the sight and sound of flame. So, before your ancestors ever inhaled anything unusual, fire itself was already quietly rewiring how relaxed they felt. That single detail changes the whole story you're about to hear, because it means the pull towards smoke didn't start with a plant at all. It started with the fire being irresistible on its own. Now add the smoke. Burn any plant material and you don't just get heat and ash, you get a chemical soup, and depending on what's burning, some of those chemicals cross straight into the human nervous system. Certain plants growing wild across Africa, Asia, and Europe release alkaloids and compounds that interact directly with receptors already sitting inside the human brain. Not receptors that evolved because of these plants. Receptors that were already there, waiting, doing other jobs entirely, regulating mood and memory and appetite. So when smoke carrying the right compound drifted into an ancestor's lungs for the first time, their brain didn't panic. It responded like it had been expecting a visitor it already knew. That's not folklore. That's basic neurochemistry, and it means something enormous. It means the very first time a human ever felt an altered wave of calm from breathing in campfire smoke, it wasn't a decision. It wasn't a ritual yet. It was biology recognizing biology, a lock turning to meet a key nobody had designed. Repeat that accidental discovery enough times, across enough generations, and eventually somebody stops treating it as an accident. They start recreating it on purpose. And that's where the physical evidence finally starts to appear, buried in the ground, waiting thousands of years to be found. The oldest confirmed proof of deliberate, intentional smoking comes from a burial site high in the Pamir Mountains of Central Asia, dating back roughly 2,500 years. Excavators pulled wooden braziers out of the earth, containing stones that had been superheated on purpose, coated in residue from cannabis plants bred to be unusually potent. This wasn't wild hemp used for rope or food. This was cultivated specifically to be smoked, and it was placed directly inside a burial, meaning it mattered enough to send into the afterlife with the dead. But here's a question worth sitting with. Just because the oldest confirmed evidence is 2,500 years old doesn't mean the practice is only 2,500 years old. It might just mean nothing older survived. Stone tools last millions of years because stone barely decays. A pouch of dried leaves, a wooden pipe, a handful of seeds, gone within a few centuries under normal burial conditions. Absence of evidence in this case is not evidence of absence, it's evidence of decay. For a long time, one of the only clues historians had came from a Greek writer named Herodotus, describing a nomadic people called the Scythians. He wrote that they built small enclosed tents, heated stones inside until they glowed, then threw hemp seeds directly onto them and sat inside breathing the smoke, howling, in his words, with pleasure. For centuries, people assumed he was exaggerating. Then archaeologists started digging up Scythian burial mounds and found exactly what he described: bronze braziers, heated stones, hemp residue. He hadn't been embellishing anything. If anything, he'd undersold it. Now, shift continents entirely because the story of tobacco runs on a completely separate track. Tobacco belongs to a plant family native only to the Americas, meaning it was totally unknown across Europe, Africa, and Asia until contact in the late 15th century. When European ships reached the Caribbean, sailors watched local people walking around with small glowing sticks, breathing in smoke and releasing it slowly through their noses. The sailors were baffled. Within weeks, they were doing it themselves. But American tobacco use goes back far earlier than any European ever witnessed. Chemical residue inside ancient pipes places deliberate tobacco use at least 3,500 years ago in what's now the southeastern United States. And some researchers argue it stretches back considerably further, tangled up with the earliest plant cultivation in the Amazon basin. And then there's Utah. In 2019, researchers excavating a 12,000-year-old hearth in the Great Salt Lake Desert found concentrated seeds from a wild tobacco species, positioned in a way that ruled out accident. Someone put them there on purpose, thousands of years before any pipe or pottery existed anywhere nearby. That single hearth pushed the possible timeline of intentional tobacco use back by thousands of years, and it raises an unavoidable question. If people were doing this in Utah 12,000 years ago, what were people everywhere else on the planet doing with their own local plants at exactly the same time? Because here's the uncomfortable truth. The desire to alter your own consciousness might not be a human invention at all. It might be something closer to a biological drive, sitting right alongside hunger, thirst, and the urge to reproduce. A psychopharmacologist at UCLA named Ronald Siegel spent years documenting this across the animal kingdom, and what he found is genuinely strange. Elephants will seek out and eat fermented marula fruit until they're visibly intoxicated. Reindeer across Siberia eat a particular hallucinogenic mushroom, and other reindeer, having noticed the effect, will actually drink the urine of the reindeer who ate it first, because the psychoactive compound passes through mostly intact. An entire species independently figured out drug recycling. If the pull toward altered states runs this deep in animals that never built a fire or invented a ritual, it becomes a lot harder to argue that human intoxication is purely cultural. It may be something closer to instinct, expressed through whatever plants happen to be nearby. And that instinct toward using plants deliberately goes back even further than modern humans. At El Sidrón Cave in Spain, researchers analyzing fossilized dental plaque found that Neanderthals were chewing poplar bark, which contains the same compound found in aspirin, alongside what appears to be a naturally penicillin-producing mold. This wasn't Homo sapiens. This was an entirely different human species, self-medicating with plant chemistry, tens of thousands of years before agriculture, before pottery, before anything resembling the world you know. Halfway around the globe and completely disconnected from any of these traditions, Aboriginal Australians developed their own method for pulling a psychoactive compound out of a plant. They chewed the leaves of a native shrub together with wood ash, which released the alkaloid inside far more efficiently, in essentially the same chemical principle used elsewhere in the world with an entirely different plant and an entirely different culture. Same idea arrived at independently, on a continent cut off from the rest of humanity for tens of thousands of years. That kind of repetition, showing up again and again in places with zero contact with each other, is usually a sign you're looking at something built into the species itself, not something one culture invented and passed along. Smoke also showed up constantly as medicine, long before anyone treated it as recreational. One of the oldest medical documents on Earth, written in Egypt around 1550 BC, describes inhaling smoke from heated herbs specifically to treat the throat and lungs. It sounds backwards by modern standards, treating a lung problem with smoke, but some of the herbs involved genuinely do carry pharmacological effects when inhaled, and the underlying logic wasn't foolish. Smoke reaches the lungs almost instantly, and the lungs absorb compounds directly into the bloodstream. It's the same basic principle behind a modern asthma inhaler. The delivery method survived, the burning part mercifully didn't. Ancient Greek physicians used therapeutic smoke as a matter of course. Ancient Indian medical texts describe an entire practice built around inhaling herbal smoke through pipes, with specific plants matched to specific conditions, refined over centuries. Across wildly different civilizations that had no contact with one another, the same conclusion kept appearing. Sometimes breathing in the right smoke actually helped, and in a world with no antibiotics and no surgery, sometimes was enough a reason to keep doing it. There's another piece of this that rarely gets mentioned, and it has nothing to do with chemistry at all. It's about trust. For most of human history, survival wasn't an individual project, it was a group project. People who got isolated from their group tended not to make it. People who stayed bonded to a group tended to. And bonding, real deep trust between people, doesn't happen automatically. It has to be built. Shared ritual turns out to be one of the most powerful tools humans ever found for building it. When a group of people sits together and goes through the same altered experience at the same time, something measurable happens in their brains. Neural activity starts to synchronize between them. Trust deepens. Group identity solidifies in ways that are hard to produce any other way. So, when a circle of people sat inside a sealed tent, breathing in smoke together, or passed a pipe hand to hand around a fire, that wasn't simply a party. That was infrastructure. That was the same mechanism that let a group move as one into danger and trust that everyone would come back out together. Which makes what happened next so jarring. When tobacco reached Europe in the 16th century, it spread with a speed that should sound familiar. Within decades, it went from a foreign curiosity to a continental obsession. By the 1600s, it was a global commodity. By the 1700s, powdered tobacco was fashionable in the courts of Europe. By the 1800s, cigars were everywhere. By the early 1900s, the machine-rolled cigarette had arrived. And with it, something that had never existed before. A version of tobacco engineered specifically to be cheap, fast, and as addictive as possible. What indigenous cultures in the Americas had spent thousands of years turning into something disciplined, sacred, and deeply controlled, European industry compressed into a mass-market product in under 400 years. And through the 20th century, tobacco companies took it even further, burying their own scientists' evidence that cigarettes caused cancer, marketing directly to teenagers, engineering the chemistry to hit the brain faster and hook harder. A shaman placing cannabis on heated stones during a burial ceremony, and a tobacco executive approving a cigarette ad campaign, both worked with smoke. That's essentially where the resemblance ends. So, when did humans actually start smoking? Nobody can give you an exact date, and nobody probably ever will. The physical evidence reaches back with confidence to 12,000 years, and with reasonable speculation, likely much further. But the drive underneath it, the pull toward altered states, the instinct to gather and breathe something in together, appears to be older than agriculture, older than pottery, maybe older than your own species. It might be as old as the first fire that made a tired ancestor's blood pressure drop. The first evening someone sat close to the flame and simply didn't want to leave. That thread runs unbroken for 100,000 years, straight to tonight, to whatever fire or flicker of smoke you happen to catch a whiff of. You're not doing anything new. You're doing what humans have always done. You're breathing.